Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the launch of our new research, Paying the Price. I'm Jenny Shevlin, I head up the Planning and Insight team here at Reach.
And I'm Louise Twycross-Lewis, and I head up the Insight team at PhD. So we're going to start off today's presentation setting the scene, then we're going to delve into the 4 key changes that we have identified in our research, and then end on the recommendations for brands. In this setting the scene section, I will take you through what we wanted to achieve with the research, the methodology, and some very top-line outputs. The questions we really wanted to understand were: how has the cost of living crisis changed attitudes towards sustainability? How has that in turn impacted people's behaviours? And what does it all mean for brands? We embarked on a mixed methodology approach to get to the answers of those questions. We conducted a review of existing cost of living and sustainability research. We identified that our main research question was covered, but this was usually at a top-line level, so the UK versus other markets, and was usually a smaller part within a much larger study. So we are spotting an opportunity to create a dedicated project on the topic with a UK focus. So we started this by teaming up with Made You Think to conduct an online call community with participants from all across the country with different attitudes and across different demographics. We conducted a dedicated quant survey amongst a nationally representative sample of 2,000 respondents and followed that up with questions on PhD's proprietary Beat survey. And then finally, we used qual-at-scale techniques to really deep dive into some of the themes that were unearthed in the earlier stages of the research. So we used an AI qual chatbot, and we also did some social analysis as well. As I said, one main aim of this study was to provide a nuanced view of how different people in the UK are responding to the cost of living crisis and how it's affecting their behaviour. So we looked at a wide range of different demographic groups and attitudinal groups, which unfortunately we can't do justice to in today's session, but we have pulled out certain key audiences where there are interesting differences throughout the presentation. So just for context, most of the UK say that they have been affected by the cost of living crisis. 91% say they've been affected by some degree. Young people and families are particularly squeezed, 33% of them saying that they are struggling. And those aged 55 and over are more likely than average to not be affected. And almost 70% of people feel a personal responsibility to be sustainable. And just to be clear, the percentages on the bottom reflect the proportion of these audiences that agree with this statement. So here we can see that 62% of 18 to 34s agree with this statement, and 85% of Green Party voters agree. And sustainable products are perceived to be more expensive. So as expected, those who are most affected by the cost of living crisis are more likely to agree with this. So with these financial and green tensions in mind, another question emerged for us. Are Brits prepared to pay the price in the future for their climate inaction today as a result of the cost of living crisis? I'll hand over to Jenny, who will start taking you through our key findings.
Thanks, Lou. So we really found 4 key findings throughout the research. The first is a reprioritisation through necessity. So people's current #1 priority is the cost of living crisis and not sustainability. We know that sustainability is a topic that risks being subject to social desirability bias. So to get around this, we asked respondents about their priorities unprompted first before prompting them. So this enabled us to get a truer read of how salient the climate crisis is and to quantify that perception gap. So as you can see, climate change unprompted comes out at 3%. However, this shoots up to 32% when prompted. When we ask respondents what they feel is the biggest issue facing the world right now, climate change does rank higher, but war and conflict comes out top. This shouldn't be too surprising, given how some are really struggling right now, with a third finding it hard to afford life's essentials. Younger people, families, and those living in cities are struggling the most. And when we look to data from sources like the Trussell Trust, we see that there's been a steady increase in food bank usage and the distribution of emergency food parcels. Since 1999, and particularly in the last 10 years or so, there's been a steady increase in people ranking the environment and climate change as an important issue for Britain. This peaked dramatically in November 2021 when COP26 was held in Glasgow. But since then, however, we've seen a steep decline, and so far there's been no return to the steady increase seen previously. There's also confusion around how sustainability is discussed and the language used with the personal benefits unclear. Surprisingly, we see that 38% of 18 to 34s say that they don't understand the personal benefits, and actually a third of this age group also say that they don't understand the benefits for the planet. We found that this is leading to cognitive exhaustion, as people are finding juggling their financial and sustainable priorities overwhelming. Again, we see that this overwhelm is felt higher by those who are 18 to 34. And this cognitive exhaustion is leading to feelings of fear of the future, so worrying about their children and grandchildren's future, and anger and frustration towards the current cost of living crisis, and people feeling like they just can't get any help. So in our next finding, we're seeing that this cognitive exhaustion is really leading people to increasingly focus on the here and now. So it came through very strongly that people are just not looking to the long term. They're looking at how to get through just till the next payday, or even just getting through the next day. And again, these pressures are felt much more by those who are younger. And as we saw earlier, people are struggling to understand the personal benefits of sustainability. So with our society increasingly turning inward, perhaps this is why we found out that people are interested in how sustainability can impact them locally and right on their doorsteps. Looking to the now, when we asked what has a negative impact on mental health, whilst there is anxiety around the climate crisis, there was more stress felt around the cost of living crisis and simply getting through that next month until payday. Many also perceive that being sustainable and sustainable actions are a negative thing. So things that we must sacrifice or stop doing, such as eating less meat, or those things that require more upfront investment, such as heat pumps and solar panels. This focus on the here and now has led to an unwillingness to make changes in certain areas. So, for example, 41% are unwilling to change their pensions to ensure it's not funding oil and gas companies, and 38% are unwilling to eat less or no meat. And we found that there were differences in unwillingness depending on age group. So, for example, the older generations are less willing to make changes to their diet, and the younger generations are less willing to change their travel plans and purchases such as fashion and beauty. And we're seeing this play out also in delays to larger, more expensive purchases that would have longer-term sustainability benefits. So when we dig deeper into electric vehicles, through qual data and social listening, we found that cost remains the highest concern and barrier, with incentives to buy all coming back to price and ultimately making them more affordable. And as we've seen through the data so far, the younger generation are just not as prepared as we might have thought to prioritise sustainable actions. They're often viewed as activists in this Greta Thunberg generation, really leading the way in fighting climate change. But actually, we found that there's a tension that exists. The cost of living crisis is limiting their ability to do things, and they already felt like they made enough sacrifices during COVID-19, and they just don't want to restrict themselves any longer. So perhaps this is why we found that they're less willing to cut back on things that might bring them joy in life, such as travel, beauty, and fashion.
So when looking at people's attitudes, we saw evidence of sustainability being viewed as a luxury belief. So what do we mean by luxury belief? Yes, we are referring to Suella Braverman's use of the phrase, where a luxury belief is a woke or politically correct point of view from people who have the wealth to promote seductive but irresponsible ideals, safe in the knowledge that they will be insulated from any negative effects. And when you overlay the fact that the wealthiest in the UK have the largest carbon footprint, we can see how this belief might be compelling for some. When we looked at social data, we could see that online conversations and volumes of using this phrase increased over the last 3 years, and there was a huge jump, a threefold increase in the past year following Suella's speech. The post on the left really brings this sentiment to life, with the commenter saying how people who champion ultra-low emission zones don't face the consequences, it's the workers that do. And there is other evidence that supports that the luxury belief sentiment exists. We have all seen the populist pushback against net zero policies, such as the expansion of ULEZ and negativity towards certain protester groups. 53% of people agree that the government should divert focus away from net zero policies to deal with the cost of living crisis. And again, this is slightly higher for that younger audience. The cost of living crisis in itself has arguably fueled such sentiment. As people feel the pinch, support for delaying green policies that have a financial impact on them has really increased. So families particularly, one of the groups disproportionately affected by the cost of living crisis, are more likely to be supportive of such policy delays. And as mentioned at the start, we used an AI chatbot to conduct qual at scale to really deep dive into key themes unearthed through earlier stages of the project. And one of the themes we delved into is how prevalent the luxury belief view is. And looking at the results from all of the different research elements that we conducted, it was clear to us that people believed that being sustainable costs more money, the well-off are better placed to spend that money. However, there was not large-scale negativity towards that group of people. One participant even talked about how it's the well-off who use their time researching to do some good rather than it being a negative. But however, given everything that we've just talked through, we do believe that this belief exists, that it's from a small but vocal minority, and it is growing. So sustainability is lower on people's priorities. They are focusing on what's closest to home and the short term, and there is a small but vocal green lash emerging, but things aren't as bleak as they seem. Across both our qual and quant findings, we saw that people were being more sustainable than they gave themselves credit for. So here we can see the changes that people have made over the past year that are sustainable, but they don't consider them to be. There is a perception gap, and that gap exists because they are making these changes to save money rather than save the planet. For example, 79% turned to wearing more clothes rather than putting the heating on, but only 28% considered this action to be good for the environment. And those struggling with the cost of living are more likely to be adopting more of these money-saving and greener behaviours than those who are unaffected. And in fact, the unaffected, they're quite interesting because they seem to be doing more of the behaviours that are arguably more enjoyable. So here we can see like holidaying in the UK and using local shops, whereas those who are struggling in comparison, all of the actions that they are doing more of are kind of more tied to the necessities of life, such as keeping warm and feeding themselves. And many have adopted these small and everyday changes in order to afford bigger indulgences and treats that they want to keep and retain during difficult and challenging times, such as holidays and home entertainment upgrades. This came through really strongly in both our qual and quant elements of research. And 52% of people said that they are really protective of the spend on items and experiences that boost their emotional well-being. Holidays particularly were a guilty pleasure that people are incredibly reluctant to give up. UK consumers are still prioritising holidays and leisure activities because of that emotional value they provide, particularly that all-important quality family time. And short-haul and UK holidays can be sustainable alternatives, but there is some interrogation of the value because it can be sometimes cheaper to fly abroad. And Jenny talked about the cognitive exhaustion that people feel against a backdrop that is there's so much that's out of their control. But the household and grocery categories are a space that allow for some limited sense of control. This is the space where people are making those small and everyday changes to save money and to indulge in and prioritise those experiences and products that they place value on. So in this category, we saw evidence of more planning, more strategic shopping, budgeting, taking more advantage of offers and deals. And this was all to prioritise to the places where they place a lot of value on. And there are some areas within this space that are non-negotiable. Treats and personal care, for example, are categories where people are just not going to switch. So overall, consumers are being more sustainable than they give themselves credit for, but all of their energy and attention is on saving money. So it does appear that we are, as a nation, willing to pay the price in the future for climate inaction today as a result of pressures from the cost of living crisis. But what does this all mean for brands? Brands need to get the balance right between delivering a clear sense of purpose and addressing cost of living concerns in their communications. As saving money is such a huge priority for people right now, we would suggest leading with those brand benefits before green claims. Really dial up your brand benefits, show how you're offering value to consumers, and the simpler this can be done, the better. We are not saying don't invest in green initiatives, we're just saying that you probably need to focus on what's important to consumers right now, and that is saving money. So Sainsbury's January value ad really taps into consumers' priorities right now. It delivers a really clear brand benefit of offering good food at great value. During a cost of living crisis, where people are more focused on the short term and saving money, messaging like this can be very compelling. People want to see brands recognising the financial and ethical struggles that they face when making purchase decisions. Aim for the sweet spot where cost of living and sustainable priorities collide, and that will really stand out to them. Good examples of brands doing this are John Lewis, where their members can receive a £5 voucher for using their fashion cycle service, and also Shoe's amazingly titled Sell Your Souls scheme, where people can get a £5 voucher for recycling old and unwanted shoes. And there is much warmth from our research towards brands like Etsy and Depop, who enable them to save money but be sustainable at the same time. And frame sustainable behaviours in a positive way. Such changes are often framed as a denial of pleasure and abundance, with language such as stop, sacrifice, reduce, cut down. Tap into the accidental sustainability trend by focusing on the benefits of sustainable behaviours first. And within the context of such challenging times, now is the time to inject some energy, warmth and positivity into brand communications. Skoda, for example, has really lent into this with their positive framing of their ENIAC model. This ad tells a really heartwarming tale of two robots who put their very different personalities together to create something wonderful. This is where emotive storytelling is being used to sell a sustainable product, and we think it's great.
So for the next finding, we're really seeing that evidence of that sense of retrenchment as the cost of living crisis focuses people's attention inwards and they look closer to home. We saw that people don't understand the personal benefits of being green, so we recommend that you should align your sustainability initiatives at a UK level or even more hyper-local, right down to our local communities. So a really fantastic example of this is the charity Hubbub, who installed these double slot ballot bins in high streets for general waste and cigarette butts. The bins give people the chance to vote with their rubbish. They're given light-hearted questions such as Messi or Ronaldo, Batman or Superman. And in London, on the street that they put this in, they found that cigarette butt littering overall was reduced by 8%, and at one point it dipped by 18%. And the ballot bins, as you've all seen, they've kind of gone viral on social media and they're now up and down high streets across the UK. And for our final recommendation, we find that we know that trust is in brands, government, and institutions has been in decline for some time. We know that cost of living pressures has really fed into this sense of mistrust, with accusations of big brands profiteering. Simultaneously, social media misinformation and conspiracy theories continue to dog that push to net zero and sustainability communications, the vocal minority that we spoke about earlier. And so in this environment, the case for leveraging trusted media brands is really important. So a great example of this is The Mirror, which has a really fantastic long history of campaigning for and highlighting green issues, with trusted experts like environment editor Nada Farood really leading the way. They know how to put sustainability within the context and the relevant context of people's everyday lives, so whether that's tips and tricks and life hacks, or more in-depth investigations that are relevant to their lives and local area. So just to recap, our recommendations for brands is to get that balance right between purpose and brand benefits, aim for that sweet spot where sustainability and cost of living priorities collide, frame those sustainable behaviours in a positive way, think local, and really look to trusted media environments. So just before we go on to our panel, if you scan this QR code here, you'll be able to download all of this research for yourself.
Good morning and welcome to the second half of our webinar this morning. We're going to be discussing the findings in a little bit more detail. Thank you, Lou and Jenny, for your presentation. Joining us, we will have Eva Grimmet, who is Chief Strategy Officer at PhD, and Jason Beattie, Assistant Editor of The Mirror. Please keep adding questions into the chat. We will turn to them as we go through the discussion. So yeah, keep adding those in. First off, Eva, can I turn to you? What stood out to you most from the study?
I think the thing that was interesting was the dichotomy between people's behaviours and attitude when it comes to sustainable actions. When you look at the list of the accidental sustainability actions, we're seeing really high percentages of all of these changes that people are making to their everyday lives, being that, turning the heating down, walking more, all of those kind of things, that we're seeing, behavior change on a really high scale, but the perception of those things being green is really small. So actually people are not realizing that a lot of what they're doing is sustainable. In many of those measures, I think it's less than a quarter of people consider what they're doing to be green. And I think that's really, really interesting, because there's almost a sort of a reframing opportunity about what being sustainable means. I mean, obviously the cost of living crisis is making these kind of changes happen out of necessity, but there is something positive about them.
Jason, how about you? What stood out to you?
So what is confirmed, I thought was really interesting, is what they've called the Great Green Backlash. And we're not just seeing it in this country, we're seeing it across Europe, we're seeing it in North America, it's just people are putting the climate crisis lower down the agenda of issues that they care about. And there's also, as part of this, and I say perceived because it's not necessarily true, but people are perceived resentment about being forced to do something which they could cost them money. And what I thought most interesting about this research is it shows the challenge to politicians, to journalists, and to businesses of trying to use the language of either to change people's attitudes. People accept that there's a climate crisis, but to change their behaviour, and that's a difficult thing.
This tension came out really strongly, and obviously, Jenny, Lou, you've been heavily immersed in this for for some time. What were the aspects that maybe surprised you as you went along the journey of doing the work that maybe you weren't expecting to find?
I would say, that point, that perception gap was really interesting, because I think consumers they do perceive that they're not doing enough in that space, but actually they are doing more. So I think there is an opportunity to tap into that and bring out that positivity, because there's so much negativity surround them in the wider climate that it's one of the areas where they feel they're not doing enough. But I feel like there is an opportunity to kind of celebrate or champion or push through or make them recognise they are doing more in that space. But yeah, it's a really interesting, from a behavioural point of view, it is just really interesting, that perception gap, and how, in the context of all of the other things that seem quite negative, that there's something there that potentially can be latched upon to kind of maybe encourage them to be more positive about what they are doing and do more feasible.
And I would say, to build on what Eva said as well around those accidental sustainable behaviours that have come from that place of cost first and people doing it to save money first. I think the findings around, actually it's people that are struggling more that are doing these behaviours. I think traditionally, stereotypically, it's the more affluent that you would think are going to be more into these sustainable behaviours and activities, but actually it's those that are struggling more that are the ones that are picking these up. So I thought that was really interesting. And I also thought what was really interesting was the things that people are unwilling to give up, so holidays, buying fashion and beauty, that sort of thing. I think that was a really interesting finding as well.
Big themes of the report is this idea of reprioritisation that's been occurring over the last 18 months. And I wonder, Jason, in your work, do you see that coming through from your readership, and does it potentially also change how you then are reporting on sustainability issues?
Look, we've known right from the beginning that the cost of living crisis is the biggest issue for our readers. And that we know that times are tough, that they need to balance the family budgets extremely carefully. So it's not a surprise in that respect that they have less bandwidth for other areas of concern, whether that's the climate crisis, whether it's international conflict, whether it's kind of education or whatever. But so that's not surprising. In terms of how we kind of approach this issue, we've always striven as much as possible never to lecture. Yeah, the last thing anybody wants is to be kind of bossed around, or to be kind of shamed into behaving in a certain way. And I don't think that's going to change, regardless of because that's this kind of, you don't want to ever patronize a reader. You don't, we're very proud of who does read us online and in print, and we kind of, they are, and we understand our concerns, but we also want to keep highlighting the issues. So, our environmental editor, Nada Fahuchi, does brilliant work of exposing kind of really bad pieces of kind of environmental damage, but also tying about the need to do how we can be more consumer friendly, whether it's the report she did last year from Ghana on the kind of huge kind of clothes mountain of second-hand clothes that can be just literally dumped on one country. So we kind of combine both these aspects together, and I think that works. I think people understand that it is an issue they care about. It may have slid slightly down the scale at this moment, but it hasn't gone away. And one of the interesting things we found is that it's across all demographics. So I think we're going to come and talk about young people rather than changing attitudes, but actually our research has always shown that it's across the board in terms of age, and it's across the board in terms of where people live.
I guess Eva, PhD works across so many categories, so many different clients. So we're quite privileged in that sense that we can really see what's happening in so many different sectors. So what are some of the things that maybe you've seen from different clients and different categories?
I think really interesting sort of simultaneous trading up and trading down at the same time across a number of sectors, particularly in things like grocery and alcohol and things like that. So switching out of brands and into sort of supermarket own labels, but at the same time also trading up for special occasions. So actually this sort of fewer but better choices in grocery and alcohol definitely emerging. And so there's almost like a slight polarization. I'm going to save lots of things here so that I can do occasional kind of treating here. And people are obviously scrimping and saving, and the research sort of bore that out to be able to do other things. We think about, last year UK had a bumper cinema year. Audiences went back, in droves after what had been a really rocky time through the pandemic. So there's kind of this idea of sort of home ents and treats like that people don't necessarily want to forego that, but they might change out of a branded choice to an own label choice within the supermarket. So this sort of trading up and trading down at the same time to kind of make the most of the now. There is also a much harsher side that we're seeing, in many ways, where people are having to become much more tactical. So lots more sort of financial savviness, more people sort of taking on more responsibilities at the home, the home with family, things like that they might have outsourced to other organizations. So I think it's really, really interesting that you're seeing this sort of this simultaneous sort of slight change in behaviour in both directions, sort of saving to spend.
Very strongly in the research.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And I think, I said earlier the unwillingness to give certain things up, and the fact that the pandemic, so much stuff was given up then, and people are going, I don't want to have to sacrifice these things anymore. I'm still looking for these enjoyable moments in life. And it's that, like you said, the equation that people are working out. If I can do this, this, and this, or add this, take away this, it equals a summer holiday, or it equals a weekend away, sort of thing. So I think that's really interesting, those equations that people make.
Really interesting question come through, actually, which I think we'll turn to now. And it's about perhaps one of the more surprising findings in the study, which certainly was something that surprised me when I read it. And that's about Gen Z or 18 to 24. So obviously they're kind of perceived as being the Greta Thunberg generation to some extent. And there's an assumption, I guess, that they are very pro-sustainability, as it were, because obviously they've got more of their future on the line than the rest of us. But actually, in some regards, the research seems to indicate that they're actually, to some extent, less inclined to adopt some certain sustainable behaviours, and potentially showing maybe surprising levels of skepticism about orthodox opinion on on the climate crisis. So I guess, yeah, big question. Why do you think that is? Who wants to go?
I would argue that it's less climate skepticism and more climate powerlessness, that I think this generation, care deeply, but are somewhat resigned to the fact that change is not going to happen at the pace it needs to, that their futures are uncertain, and that governments aren't making a big enough change. So why should they change what they're doing? Because actually, how can they as an individual make a big change when no one else is? And whilst there is definitely this kind of whole emerging thing that they're not doing as much in the sustainable space, I think it was interesting that they were least likely to support the government in delaying of the petrol and diesel car ban, and I think that's them kind of going, oh God, like not even, I can't do much, the government needs to do more, and oh God, they're even delaying stuff further. So I think it's really interesting to try and unpick what's happening in younger age groups. But I think it's not a skepticism. I think it's an utter powerlessness and not really knowing what to do with it, and therefore not seeing how their behaviour change can make any difference.
Yeah, I think if you look at studies from 2 or 3 years ago, they were more likely to be supportive of those green initiatives. And I think one of the big surprises in our research is how they seem to be a bit more resistant than the average. And I wonder if it is because they are feeling quite disenfranchised, they're trying to justify their inaction, and they also just don't want to miss out. They don't want to stop doing the things that they feel that older generations have had the chance to enjoy and do. And it's a slightly easier way of just saying, yeah, I can zone out because I don't quite believe in this. So yeah, I think they do care, but I think that there's a willingness to kind of like justify not doing very much.
Your readers?
Well, I was going to actually throw some statistics at you. Actually, what we're seeing in the continent is really interesting. That if you look at the far right parties, they're gaining their support from the younger generation. So in France, the Marine Le Pen, the far right leader there, at the last election, 49% of 24 to 34-year-olds voted for her. I know, it gets scarier. In Italy, the majority of people under 35 voted for Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party. In the recent Dutch elections, it was the same thing. Now you ask, well, the next question is why? Because actually most of these parties actually are very anti-climate change and have, they have anti-net zero policies. They are trading off it. So you're thinking there's a kind of huge kind of like, this doesn't add up problem here. And it actually comes back to what we're talking about. They can't get homes. That's more of a priority. So you've got politicians coming along saying, look, we'll get you a home. They're going to vote for them. If you're going to say, look, we're going to ease the cost of living crisis for you, they're going to vote for them. So it's like, that is, as I think we're coming back to this major challenge, you've got to explain to people, this is fighting climate change can't be an add-on luxury. Yeah, we've got to show them how it can work.
I mean, that brings us on to another interesting theme within the work, this concept of luxury beliefs. And obviously we're in an election year. Last week, Labour have pulled back on their £28 billion Green Plan pledge. I mean, how big a part in this election do you think sustainability will play?
In a wide context, the environment is actually going to be probably more than people realise. Now, whether that is the sewage in your rivers and seas, or whether it's the air quality, or whether it's having access to decent public transport, all these things matter. They're all part of this kind of broader issue. I think yet we have seen Labour water down its pledge. That was more to do with economics and the environment, what I mean. It was that they want to look as seem very economically responsible rather than, but they're still very keen to push the green credentials because they have to. One, because they have a generally younger support of them Conservatives, and they do care about this issue, and also their threat from the Green Party, which did very well in local elections. The Green Party last year, kind of under-recorded well. I think actually the Conservatives made a mistake. There was this by-election in Boris Johnson's old seat last year where the Tories held on to it, this huge anti-Ule campaign. And then following that, Rishi Sunak kind of rewrote Tory policy to actually kind of make it kind of, watered down, kind of ditched an awful lot of the government's kind of environmental promises. It hasn't made any difference. And actually, anything, it's backfired, because I think there's still that sizable percentage, particularly in some of the seats the Tories really need to win, like in the Tory shires or up against the Lib Dems, where the environment really matters still. And I think they misread one result. So yeah, it will be on ballot paper, but it will, as I said right at the beginning, it's going to be below cost of living. It's going to be below how good your local hospital is, how good your local school is. Yeah, but it's still going to be there.
Yeah, I think actually just going to add, just one of the things that came through really strong was how unpopular ULEZ is nationally, because we thought it might be more concentrated in the areas most affected, but I think there might be association in people's minds that it's an overreach of government and, you know, into telling them what to do, which you said that people don't respond well to. So yeah, it was just really interesting.
So I mean, this idea of luxury belief, you mentioned it. I mean, obviously, it's a phrase that's gained some traction in the UK, but it also has resonance in other European markets as well. Do we feel this is something that's, you know, a relatively small proportion of the population, but is growing, or do you think it potentially might become a much more prominent perception?
Yeah, I guess that's what we found in the research was around it's a minority, but they are really loud and they shout really loudly. And then so if you're in your little Twitter bubble, then you might think, oh, everyone thinks that. And obviously when you're in the echo chamber as well. But I think, yeah, so I think there is that minority there, but they are just very loud. So you would think that there's more of them than there actually are. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that starts to grow even further.
Move on to talk about marketing and what this might mean for brands and their communications. So if I can turn to you first, Eva, one of the big themes in the study was about this idea of a rebalance, perhaps, in how brands approach sustainability in their communications. How should brands think about going about that?
I think obviously sustainability is hugely important. I think it plays a very, you know, key part of what a brand does. I think when we talk about balancing, I think obviously back to sort of how people are voting and all sorts of things. For a product, for a brand, it has to meet certain needs. It's always going to have to meet those needs. Sustainability might not be one of those needs. So thinking about how the role sustainability plays within the marketing mix, I think, is really important. You know, I think a few years ago, it did feel very bandwagony, and I think that skepticism from consumers kind of came through in how they feel about how brands talk about it. I think there's a really powerful role for sustainability messages. But if you are going to put sort of above the line marketing spend behind them, I think you have to be very clear on the role for it. I think you can see very clearly how, you know, utilizing, you know, your own a brand's own real estate, its packaging, CRM, all sorts of things like that, where actually that kind of message can be really important. And for a lot of people, I think sustainability can play a huge role in a sort of post-purchase affirmation. Actually, I've made this purchase. I was going to make this purchase, but I now feel better about it. Or indeed, perhaps it might stop someone trading down to a sort of an own label versus a brand and things like that. I think if sustainability is at the absolute core of a brand's purpose, then it can be a hero marketing message. You think about brands like Patagonia. I think if it's not the sort of, you know, it has its absolute core product, but it's a part of its business operations, then I think thinking carefully about how you support it. I'm not saying don't support it. Absolutely is really important, but just thinking very carefully about how it's supported across paid, owned and earned.
Actually builds on that slightly, which it would be good to get your thoughts on, Eva, now. So that someone's asked, Luke Jones has asked, are there any particular categories that we think are doing particularly well in regards to getting this balance right in terms of sustainability, and any categories that we think maybe aren't doing so well?
I would say that we are seeing, I don't know that they're doing well, but I think we're beginning to see a sea change in fashion. So we're beginning to see much more, because obviously fashion is a hugely polluting category in many ways. And I think we're beginning to see the sea change in new kind of consumption models, you know, the rise of second hand, the rise of renting. You know, renting's become a very, you know, again, I'd say that probably is slightly at the more wealthier end of a lot of audiences, but it's a different kind of consumption model. We're beginning to see brands in the fashion space take more care around it. I mean, you know, there are examples of Shoe and John Lewis, you know, giving people £5 to bring in old kind of stock, and actually Marks and Spencers have done sort of, you know, the Plan A clothes recycling scheme for many, many years.
Yeah.
So it's not that I think fashion is doing it well, but I think I've seen the biggest change in any category, I think, over the last year has come in fashion.
Lou, Jenny, any builds on that?
I guess the bit about it was the bit about the people unwilling to want to travel and go on holiday. I think that's really interesting, and I think it'll be really interesting to see as the cost of living crisis progresses. I think maybe they're not behind. I think obviously travel companies have got it really hard. It's really, really difficult for travel companies to kind of have that sustainable messaging. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond to it. I'd also say as well, one implication that I really liked was the idea of moving away from you've got to do less, it's really bad, sacrificing, you know, because no one wants to make sacrifices, all this negative stuff. So I think there's something really nice and positive in that. Make it joyful, make it uplifting, make it, you know, you get to the opportunity to do more things. What can you do? This morning I saw that Joe Lycett's next campaign is all around, and his next show is going to be all around the polluted rivers and our oceans and everything, and kind of, you know, so a comedian taking on that and all of the stunts that will come as a part of that. So I think, you know, him highlighting such an important issue and doing it in his very, you know, very thorny but very comedic way, I think is the, you know, a right way for people to go, okay, I really care about this issue of the, you know, the polluted rivers.
I would also say we have clients that sort of sit in the FMCG and kind of grocery retailer space, and I think there's some great examples there of brands that are taking a more active role in sustainability sort of space, whether that's through their sort of supply chain, through how they're sourcing products, things like that. So it's not every sort of grocery and sort of food FMCG brands as it is there. I think there's lots of positive momentum, I think, within kind of food and grocery.
Yeah, well. I think it's space, and to your point earlier, the easier brands can make it for consumers, the better. So like McCain, like saying that they source their products through farming, consumer doesn't need to do anything different, and it adds value at the purchase decision stage. You know, that's fantastic. You know, consumer literally just continues like buying and doing what they normally do. So I think it's a really interesting space because of examples like that, but also because that's where people can make their small and everyday changes to lean into the treats and luxuries that they want to afford.
And I think that the power of positive storytelling here is so important. And I remember listening to the boss of Iceland explaining, because they were one of the first to try and go plastic free, and he was saying we found two things instantly. One was we moved from plastic egg boxes to cardboard ones, and our sales of eggs went up. And they said that's because customers thought they looked fresher. And then he said the other problem we had was that our sales of steak went down. They were trying to work it out, and they found that they were easy to shop it because when they had a cardboard covering, people could fold them over and put them down their trousers more easily. But I just thought these are brilliant stories about the challenges of going green.
Yeah.
And they, you know, there's a positive one, there's a negative one, but they add to this great mix. And from a kind of, you know, from a journalist point of view, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I guess one of the other things that came through in the study was this idea of consumers turning inwards, and I suppose related to that idea of how do you tell a kind of a positive story that resonates with people is the idea that you know, national brands or international brands can tap into this feeling of you know, the importance of local community, but that's quite a difficult thing to do, right? Because obviously if you're a big global brand, how do you credibly talk to someone in, you know, a certain part of the UK? How do you do that, Eva?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to resonate locally, get involved with local things. You know, there's loads of grassroots initiatives. Doesn't have to be sport. I think everyone immediately goes to local football teams when they think about local. Doesn't have to be that, but there's, you know, there's grassroots sort of communities in all sorts of different areas. And I think if you, as a brand, you are serious about wanting to do that, then put your money where the mouth is and get involved, roll your sleeves up and talk to those communities.
I think the key, I think people are like kind of turning more inwards and what's closest to them. So as long as, you know, global national brands can tap into their you know, their colleagues in those markets and think of something that's really tangible and easy to see, you know, within those areas, I think that's what's going to add the credibility.
Because I guess probably in the last 12 striking stories in the sustainability space in the UK have probably been Ulis for one, and then, you know, sewage in rivers and seas, which are, you know, incredibly localized and people feel incredibly passionate about.
And it really came through in the research about how looking at you know, so if you're cleaning product, for example, we're not, you know, it's not going to, you know, destroy the oceans. We've made it so it's not, you know, destroying the fish like over in the Atlantic, but actually that's kind of difficult for people to. The ocean is a really big thing, but actually if you make it through to your local waterways or even right down to, you know, the pipes, you know, once you've had the shower or once you put the washing machine on, that people can understand that context of that product a bit more. So obviously that's a really easy example for a cleaning product to do, but I guess, yeah, it's working out how does your product and the sustainable benefits fit into that local context.
One of the kind of dogged this whole space over the last 5-10 years from a communications point of view has been this concept of greenwashing, and this idea that, you know, people are kind of trumpeting their sustainability claims to sort of burnish their overall brand and so on. So I didn't realise people probably know what greenwashing means, but anyway, there we go. I wonder whether, as a result of what we're seeing here, this brands may be starting to focus a bit more on the value offering that they're putting into the market and a bit less about just going on about their sustainability claims for their own sake. So do we think greenwashing maybe is a thing of the past? Are we starting to move beyond that maybe?
I think so, because people are really skeptical about a brand's green credentials, and it's never been easy to find out actually if they are walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And I also think actually if people, consumers, sort of suspect greenwashing, it is really off-putting. It can have like an adverse effect. So I think that moving forwards, yeah, I think brands are increasingly careful about what they do and how they say it. So I would say we're probably, yes, at a tipping point of greenwashing.
There was the example in the qual research of the 2 receipts.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. Yeah, it was just that one of our participant community showed us 2 receipts where I think it's the FSC logo, and basically said one showed the logo saying the paper was recycled but didn't really understand what that meant, and then the second receipt had, like, I think it was like maybe 3 sentences explaining what the, you know, how the paper for that receipt had been recycled. I think it was just a really simple way of just bringing clarity to what that logo and what it meant to a consumer. And our research showed that people aren't really clear on what certain the language around sustainability, what it all means, and they're not really clear what the benefits are. But that's a really simple way of bringing that clarity. And I think that kind of understanding, it needs to happen before even tackling kind of greenwashing, really, because there is so much confusion out there. I think it's more easy to dismiss something when you don't understand it. So I think the more brands, and this can be across multiple touch points, it doesn't just need to be comms, it could be as simple as your receipt or your packaging, bringing that understanding, I think is a great way of tackling that.
And Jason, greenwashing is that still a problem?
Consumers are wise enough to know it's, as soon as the consumer is kind of aware of this, there's no point doing it. I do think it's what you're saying. I mean, one of the things I'm very frustrating in this country is actually there's so many little things we could be doing to nudge people towards better behaviour we're not doing. But in France, for example, we're bringing a law now that you have to show on the label of your clothing how sustainable it is. So you're giving consumers the choice. And I just think little things like that. They've brought in a law in France as well, saying that every public square has to have a drinking fountain, get rid of plastic bottles. These things are really simple, and and they're not punitive either. That's the other thing. And I just think but we're very slow in this country, and we can change behaviour without lecturing, and with, as Jenny says, without feeling people have to make a sacrifice.
They're very examples, aren't they? It's nothing that it's only enhancing.
Yeah.
Just got a question fresh in from Gemma Bainton. The research identified how consumers are switching to own brand in a cost of living crisis. What can FMCG brands do to become seen as valuable enough to consumers to justify charging their higher price point for a similar product? Eva, I'm going to turn to you first.
They could make money if I could answer that really quantifiably. I think, I mean, it's a number of things, and I think it is really important. Like, the strength of the brand in this situation is absolutely critical. I think if the brand strength, sort of the familiarity, the warmth, all of those things towards a brand aren't that strong, it is, I mean, this is a no-brainer to switch out and to go into an own label. I think really focusing on brand strength is really important. I think that again, I think the on-pack messaging can often, if someone is standing literally in an aisle and they have 2 packets and one is £1 cheaper, and they kind of look what are the brand stories you're telling at that point of purchase, that could be more motivating. And I think there's a whole host of things that can be done that's sort of nothing to do with sort of the media side of marketing, which is obviously careful management of price, pack size, to sort of enable people to be able to get sort of slightly more for their purchase. There's all sorts of things like that. But it is a really, really hard one.
And I guess in some cases, it is derived from a sense of brand purpose, which may in turn be derived from being very progressive from a sustainability perspective. So depending on the sector, it may be actually about sustainability to build the brand.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
Because we did find that more of those products in the FMCG space, in like the chocolate bar, the box of chocolates that you're going to eat when you're watching Netflix, that sort of thing. They were the things that people were willing to trade down on, because they were like, no, I like my brand, I like that particular tomato sauce, like on my chips, sort of thing. That's the best one. So there are certain products in that treat space that people are willing to.
They're very connected to specific sort of eating occasions and moments that people actually don't maybe want to sacrifice.
Any more on that one?
Nothing to add.
Okay, I think what we'll do now is we'll turn to a kind of final question, because we're starting to run out of time. And I think let's make this quite expansive. And it'll be great to hear your thoughts on, I suppose, where this whole trend, or set of trends really, is going over the next 12, 18 months, 2 years, let's say. What do you think might change or not change in this area?
For me, I think it's something that was on in the research, which is the intersection of cost of living and everything that kind of brings with it, with sustainable behaviours, and not seeing them as an either or, seeing them as additive, fundamentally change has to happen. It has to happen quite rapidly over the next few years. So I think there is a big opportunity in that intersection, and exploring that and thinking about how actually you can live well to a certain degree, sort of from a financial perspective, as well as from a sort of bigger picture perspective. I mean, people are struggling, and let's make no bones about it. It is really tough for many, but actually we don't that sense of cognitive overwhelm where actually you can't do everything. Actually, there's something reassuring in actually you are already doing quite a bit. You might not realise it. I think that's interesting, and trying to play in that space more.
And it actually ties in with the positive storytelling to some degree, right? Actually having some positivity in that space.
Yeah, and show people that you actually do more than you've given yourself credit for. And I think, obviously, given the cost of living crisis obviously isn't going away anytime soon, mortgage rates are still going to, be all messy and everything. I think So I think we're not going to see necessarily any changes in the findings. And I also think that, you know, it being an election year, I think that's going to be really interesting to see, yeah, how big a part does it play in the election. I think that's going to be really interesting as well. Obviously, looking at the data that we got from Ipsos about, you know, the spike in interest around COP and then the spike in interest around big weather events. It's always interesting to see, obviously, but what about those little in between moments? That's always, I think, the bit we should be looking out for as well, and the attitudes and what people are thinking then.
Lou?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, to the points that have already been made, like, you know, people are still going to be struggling with the cost of living crisis. We're now officially in recession, albeit the stats just in little way puts there. So I think we're going to see a continuation of those behaviours, but I think it would be good to see how we can move from, you know, bringing that positivity into what people are already doing and what they could be doing. And also, I think, you know, like maybe from a consumer point of view, we'll get to a stage where we've been dealing with quite a lot of, you know, black swan events and negativity for a really long time, and just a gravitation, like even, I suppose, even just from that day to day, gravitating towards treats and luxuries are a desire for people to move towards like that, the positive. So I think, yeah, tapping into that, reframing what they're doing in that particular space with their sustainable behaviours will be really important.
Jason, final thoughts.
I think that actually everybody thinks they're a minority on this issue, and actually probably the minority is actually the majority, they just don't realise it. So I'm more optimistic about the desire to live a more kind of environmentally sustainable life. And my other thought is actually, I think people are way ahead of the policymakers in terms of already doing these things. You know, the whole make do amend movement, for example, the fact that people kind of no mow May now, they don't mow their lawns in, you know, for 1 month a year. They know that, you know, that's nobody's told them to do this. It's a kind of, you know, it's been literally a grassroots movement. Forgive the pun.
Very good.
But it's like, and it's happening anyway. And I think, you know, but that gives me grounds for optimism. And yeah, there's headwinds because it's become a very political issue, and it's been used by the right as a kind of, you know, a wedge issue. But I think, you know, long term, I think we're moving towards a, you know, a kind of rewilding, not just of the open space but political space.
Well, I think that's a great note to end it on, a sense of optimism. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to Lou and Jenny for the amazing research. Thank you to Eva and Jason for joining the panel. Very shortly, there should be a QR code coming up on your screen for you to be able to download the report, and Jenny and Lou's email addresses if you want to contact them, ask any questions or find out more. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.